The street didn't care who you were. Cars rushed past like he didn't exist. Shoes clicked against the pavement, fast and impatient. Heads down, eyes glued to phones. The city moved the way it always did, loud, busy, unforgiving. And right there, on a cold corner between a closed cafe and a flickering streetlight, stood a kid no one was looking at. He couldn't have been more than 15. His jacket was too thin for the weather, the sleeves frayed at the cuffs. The guitar in his hands looked older than he was, scratched wood, one tuning peg replaced with tape, strings that had clearly been stretched one performance too far. Still, he held it carefully like it was the most valuable thing he owned. Because it was. He took a breath, a small one. The kind you take when you're used to being ignored. Then he started to play. The first notes of Mama, I'm Coming Home drifted into the noise of the street, soft at first, almost unsure. His voice wasn't perfect. There was a roughness to it, a crack that came from cold nights and too many unspoken thoughts. But it was honest. Painfully honest. This wasn't a performance for tips. This was a confession. As he sang, his eyes stayed fixed on the pavement. Not because he was shy, but because he'd learned not to expect anything back. He sang like someone talking to a memory, not a crowd. Like someone hoping the words might travel farther than he ever could. People passed him anyway. A businessman brushed by without slowing down. A couple laughed at something on a phone. Someone dropped a coin without looking, the metal clinking against the guitar case like punctuation at the end of a sentence no one had read. The song kept going. Mama, I'm coming home. To him, those words weren't lyrics. Or maybe a wish. Maybe both. No one knew how long he'd been standing there. No one knew where he would sleep that night. And no one knew that this song, the same one echoing faintly between buildings, was the only thing keeping him upright. On that corner, he wasn't chasing fame. What would you do if you saw a kid performing alone on the street? He was just trying not to disappear. And for a moment, it seemed like the world was going to let him. He didn't end up on that street by accident. Long before the guitar case hit the pavement, before his fingers learned where to land without thinking, before the city became his audience, there was a small room that smelled like soap and warm tea. There was a chair by the window. And there was a woman who used to hum while she cleaned, his mother. Music was never a dream back then. It was just something that existed in the background of their life. An old radio on the counter, songs drifting through cracked speakers, melodies filling the spaces where words weren't needed. When Mama, I'm Coming Home played, she would always turn it up. Sometimes she smiled. Sometimes she didn't say anything at all. He never asked why. Later, when things started falling apart, he understood. The house didn't break all at once. It happened quietly. Bills stacked up. Conversations grew shorter. The humming stopped. Some nights, his mother would sit at the table long after dinner staring at nothing, hands wrapped around a cold mug. Other nights, she wasn't there at all. Then one day, she kissed his forehead, pressed a few folded bills into his hand, and told him to be strong. That was the last clear memory he had of her. No dramatic goodbye. No answers. Just silence that stretched on longer than he knew how to handle. The guitar came later. He found it in a second-hand shop, leaning in a corner like it had been forgotten on purpose. It was cheap, slightly broken. But when he strummed it, something in his chest loosened. He traded a week's worth of odd jobs for it, and carried it everywhere after that, on buses, through alleys, across nights that felt endless. Music became the only way he knew how to talk about her. He didn't sing on the street because he wanted sympathy. He sang because the walls of shelters were too thin, and the nights were too loud with other people's pain. On the street, at least, he could choose his own silence between songs. And he chose that corner for a reason. The cafe behind him used to play music late into the night. The streetlight buzzed in a way that almost sounded like harmony. And if he stood in just the right spot, the sound of the guitar bounced back to him, fuller, warmer, like he wasn't alone. When he sang, Mama, I'm Coming Home, it wasn't about going back to a place. It was about going back to a feeling, safety, being seen, being someone's responsibility. Each time he played it, he imagined her somewhere, maybe on another street, maybe in another city, maybe just in his memory hearing him. Knowing he hadn't given up, knowing he was still trying. Money helped, sure. Coins bought food. Small bills bought time. But the real reason he stayed there, day after day, was simpler. As long as he kept singing that song, she wasn't completely gone. And as long as his voice held out, neither was he. By the time the song reached its second verse, the street had filled the way it always did, without noticing him. The corner became a moving river of people, each one carrying a private urgency. Coffee cups steamed in gloved hands. Earbuds sealed off entire worlds. A delivery truck growled as it squeezed past, its engine briefly swallowing the sound of the guitar before moving on like nothing had happened. The kid kept playing. His fingers were numb now, but muscle memory did the work. The melody held steady, even as the wind cut through his jacket and slipped down his collar. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, not to be dramatic, just to stay warm. No one stopped. A man in a tailored coat slowed for half a second, glanced at the guitar, and frowned as if the song were an inconvenience. A group of teenagers filmed a few seconds, laughed, and walked away before the chorus could finish. Someone else dropped a coin into the case without breaking stride, like tossing spare change into a machine that existed only to clear guilt. The kid didn't look up. He'd learned early that eye contact made rejection sharper. When people met your gaze and still walked away, it felt personal. When they never saw you at all, it felt expected. The song echoed off glass windows and brick walls, but it didn't stick. It slid past people the same way he did, unnoticed, uninvited, easy to ignore. To the crowd, it was just noise. To him, it was everything he hadn't said out loud. He sang about coming home, standing in a place where home felt like a rumor. He sang about love, surrounded by strangers who didn't have time for it. Every lyric landed somewhere inside him that the city couldn't touch, but the city never noticed the difference. A woman adjusted her scarf and crossed the street to avoid him. A cyclist rang a bell, irritated that the sound of the guitar broke the rhythm of traffic. Someone muttered, "Get a job," under their breath, not even loud enough to be cruel, just careless enough to be honest. The kid swallowed and kept singing. He'd seen real musicians on screens under lights, with crowds screaming their names. He knew he didn't look like that. He didn't sound like that either. His voice carried scratches, pauses, breaths that came too fast. But there was something in it, something raw, something real. The problem was, reality doesn't stop people. It doesn't wave its arms. It doesn't demand attention. It waits to be noticed, and on that street, nothing waited very long. A bus pulled up at the corner, blocking him from view. For a few seconds his song disappeared entirely, trapped between the engine's hiss and the slam of doors. When the bus pulled away, he was still there. Still singing. Still holding the note like it mattered. The crowd flowed around him, not against him. That was the cruelest part. If they had hated him, at least that would have meant he existed. If they had mocked him, it would have meant he'd broken through somehow. But indifference let him vanish while standing in plain sight. A little girl tugged on her father's hand, pointing toward the guitar. The father shook his head and guided her forward, already late for something more important. The kid saw it out of the corner of his eye and felt a quiet ache settle in his chest, not anger, not sadness. Just a familiar heaviness. Was this luck, destiny, or talent finally being seen? He finished the chorus. The street answered with nothing. No applause, no silence, just movement. He let the last chord fade naturally, the way he always did, and for half a second, he allowed himself to hope. Maybe someone would stop. Maybe someone had actually listened. But the moment passed. He started the next verse anyway, because missing it didn't hurt as much as not trying. And because somewhere deep inside him, he still believed that if the right person heard the song, not just the sound, but the story behind it, everything could change. The crowd didn't know it yet, but they were about to miss something they'd never forget. The kid didn't notice him at first. How could he? The street was full of faces, hundreds of them, each one passing like a blur. People came in waves, breaking and reforming, the same rush of coats and bags and footsteps. If you tried to study every stranger, your mind would collapse from the noise. So he stayed focused on the guitar. He kept his eyes low, watching his fingers travel the worn fretboard, pressing down on strings that cut into his skin. He played the way you play when you've played through hunger, through cold, through nights where the only light came from street lamps and vending machines. And then, something shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of change you feel before you understand it. The air around him tightened, like a room when a conversation suddenly stops. The crowd sound didn't vanish, but it softened, as if the street itself had leaned in without realizing. He sang the line again, voice rough but steady. "Ma, I'm coming home." A few steps behind the moving crowd, Near the edge of a shop window, a man had stopped walking. He wasn't trying to be seen. That was the strange part. He didn't push forward. He didn't pull out a phone. He didn't call anyone over. He simply stopped, hands in his pockets, like he'd been caught by something invisible and didn't want to break it. The man wore a dark coat that looked expensive but not flashy. His hair was longer than most men's, falling past his collar in a messy, familiar way. Sunglasses covered his eyes even though the sky was gray and the light was weak. It wasn't a look at me kind of style. It was more like armor, something you wear when you're tired of being recognized. He listened. Not the way people pretend to listen while their mind drifts. Not the way someone listens to decide if you're good enough. He listened the way you listen when a sound pulls you back to a moment in your own life. The kid's voice cracked on a note. He caught it and corrected, pressing forward like he always did. The man's mouth lifted slightly at the corner, almost a smile. He wasn't judging. He wasn't amused. He was impressed. And for the first time that day, someone wasn't just hearing the song. Someone was hearing the kid. The crowd still moved, still rushed, still ignored the music, until a young guy walking past glanced at the man in the sunglasses and slowed. His eyes narrowed, trying to place the face. He stopped, then another person looked, then another. The effect was small at first, like one domino tipping. A ripple, a pause, a soft, "Wait, is that?" whispered under someone's breath. The kid felt it without seeing it. The street had a different energy now. People were shifting, not away from him, but toward something behind him. He tried to ignore it, because street performers learn quickly. If you chase attention, it runs. So he stayed in the song. But curiosity is louder than music. Someone lifted their phone. Not at the kid, at the man standing back, still quiet, still listening like the moment mattered. A woman covered her mouth. A teenager's eyes widened. Another voice whispered the name a little louder this time. Ozzy. The kid's fingers stuttered for half a beat. He almost lost the chord. Ozzy Osbourne. That was impossible. That was a name that belonged to stages, not sidewalks. Lights, not street lamps. Security guards, not random crowds. Legends didn't appear on corners like this. Legends existed behind curtains and backstage doors, in stories people told. The kid didn't turn around right away. Fear held him still. Not fear of Ozzy, but fear of hope. Fear of being wrong. Fear of the embarrassment of turning around and finding nothing. Just another stranger. Just another moment his imagination had tried to make bigger than it was. His voice shook slightly as he reached the chorus again. "Mama, I'm coming home." And then, as if the street had decided to answer, a shadow fell across the edge of his guitar case. Not threatening, not sudden, just present. The kid finally looked up. The crowd had parted in a thin line, like a path opening through water. And there he was. Sunglasses. Long hair, that unmistakable posture, relaxed, a little crooked. Like he'd lived through chaos and made peace with it. A face the world knew, even if the world couldn't believe it belonged here. Ozzy didn't speak yet. He just nodded once, slow and respectful, like he was acknowledging the music and the person making it. The kid's breath caught. His hands trembled so hard he almost dropped the pick, and in that single second, before anything big happened, before the crowd exploded, before phones filled the air, one truth hit him like a wave. Someone had finally stopped. Not because they felt sorry. Not because they wanted to be kind. But because the song was real enough to pull a legend off the sidewalk and make him listen. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Not Ozzy. Not even the crowd that had slowly gathered, frozen in that rare space between disbelief and awe. The city, so loud just moments ago, felt like it had taken a breath and forgotten how to let it out. The kid's hands were shaking now. He stared at Ozzy like the image might blur or disappear if he blinked too hard. Legends weren't supposed to stand this close. They weren't supposed to feel this human. Ozzy wasn't larger than life in this moment. He was quieter than life, calmer than the chaos around him. Ozzy tilted his head toward the guitar, a small, encouraging gesture. "Keep going." The kid swallowed. His throat felt tight, like the song had suddenly become heavier. He adjusted his grip on the pick, pressed his fingers down harder than necessary, and forced himself to breathe. Then he played. The chord rang out clearer this time, stronger. Not because his hands were steadier, but because something inside him had shifted. Fear was still there, but it had been joined by something else now. Validation. Permission. He sang the next line, voice trembling but true. "Mama, I'm coming home." Ozzy leaned in slightly and, without asking, without announcing himself, he sang too. Not loud. Not to perform, just enough to be there. The sound of their voices together, one raw and young, the other worn and unmistakable, cut through the street like electricity. Phones rose instinctively, but no one shouted, no one clapped. The moment demanded silence. Ozzy didn't overpower the kid. He didn't take the lead. He matched him, adjusting his voice, softening it, letting the kid stay at the center of the song. It was the kind of thing only someone who had nothing left to prove would do. The kid felt tears sting his eyes, but he didn't stop. Every lyric landed differently now. The song wasn't just about missing someone anymore. It was about survival, about making it this far, about being heard after thinking you never would be. The crowd had changed completely. People weren't rushing anymore. They weren't checking their phones or looking for exits. They stood shoulder to shoulder, strangers bound together by a moment they hadn't planned to be part of. Some smiled, some cried, some just stared, afraid that reacting too much might shatter whatever magic had settled over the street. A man whispered, "This is unreal." Someone else whispered, "He didn't even steal the spotlight." Ozzy glanced at the kid during the chorus and nodded again, this time with something like pride, like he was saying, "You're doing great. This is yours." The kid's voice grew stronger, not perfect, never perfect, but fuller, braver. He lifted his head for the first time since he'd started playing that day, and sang out into the street instead of down at the pavement. For the first time, the city listened back. When they reached the final chorus, Ozzy stepped half a pace back. It was subtle, easy to miss, but it mattered. He let the kid finish it alone. The kid held the last note longer than he ever had before, pouring everything into it. Every cold night, every unanswered question, every memory of his mother's humming. When the sound finally faded, it didn't disappear into traffic this time. It lingered. Then the street erupted. Applause crashed in from every direction. People cheered. Someone shouted Ozzy's name. Someone else shouted the kid's. Coins and bills rained into the guitar case, but none of it mattered as much as the noise, the proof that he had been seen. The kid stood there, stunned, chest rising and falling fast, like he'd just run a mile. Ozzy stepped forward again and placed a hand on the kid's shoulder. Not dramatic, not for cameras, just solid. "Real, you've got something," Ozzy said quietly, voice rough but warm.
Don't let it go.
The kid nodded, unable to speak, because in that moment, everything he thought the world had taken from him, his home, his safety, his sense of being chosen, came rushing back in a single truth. One song had changed everything, and nothing would ever sound the same again. The applause didn't fade right away. It rolled through the street in waves, echoing off windows and storefronts, louder than traffic, louder than the city ever was for him. People clapped until their hands hurt, like they were afraid that stopping would somehow undo what had just happened. The kid stood frozen in the middle of it. His ears rang. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. Just minutes ago, he'd been another face no one noticed. Now strangers were smiling at him like they knew him, like they were proud of him. Ozzy stepped back into the crowd, not disappearing, but not chasing attention either. He took off his sunglasses for a moment, wiped his eyes quickly and slipped them back on. A few people tried to call out to him, but he raised a hand gently, let it breathe, and the noise softened. That was when the kid realized something important. Ozzy hadn't come to be seen. He'd come to listen. People crowded around the guitar case, dropping bills instead of coins now. Someone asked the kid his name. Another offered him a coffee. A woman pressed a scarf into his hands, insisting he take it. Each gesture felt unreal, like kindness arriving all at once to make up for months of absence. The kid barely heard the words. His mind kept replaying the moment Ozzy's voice had joined his. The way the legend had stepped back and let him finish. The way respect had been given without conditions. That mattered more than money. Eventually the crowd thinned. Not because interest was gone, but because moments like this can't stay loud forever. People drifted away, shaking their heads, already retelling the story into phones, already uploading clips that would travel farther than that street ever could. The kid sat down on the curb and finally exhaled. His hands were still trembling. Ozzy walked over and crouched in front of him, eye level now. No distance left between legend and kid. "You did the hard part already," Ozzy said. "You showed up." The kid nodded again, words still stuck somewhere behind his ribs. Ozzy glanced at the guitar. "Keep playing, every day, even when no one stops." Then he stood, squeezed the kid's shoulder one last time, and melted back into the city the same way he'd arrived, quietly. No entourage, No announcement, just gone. The street returned to normal, cars moved, people walk. The cafe door opened and closed. But the kid knew better now. Normal wasn't the same as before. Something permanent had shifted. He packed up his guitar slowly, carefully. The case was heavier than it had ever been, not just with money, but with possibility. For the first time, the future didn't feel like an empty stretch of road. It felt like a direction. As evening settled in, he played again, not for the crowd that had already left, not for cameras. He played for himself. The notes came easier now, less weighed down by doubt. The streetlight buzzed on above him, familiar and steady. And somewhere deep inside, a thought finally took root. Maybe I won't always be here. The world hadn't changed overnight. He still didn't know where he'd sleep. He still didn't know what tomorrow held. But he knew one thing for certain now. His voice mattered. And once the world hears you even just once, it never fully forgets. Neither did he. By the next morning, the street had moved on. New footsteps replaced the old ones. New sounds filled the air. The corner looked exactly the same to anyone passing by, just another piece of pavement in a busy city. No plaque, no sign, no evidence that anything extraordinary had happened there at all. But for the kid, everything was different. Clips of the moment were already spreading. Shaky videos, different angles, different reactions. Some caught the instant Ozzy's voice joined in. Others focused on the kid's face when he realized who was standing beside him. The comments poured in, thousands of strangers arguing, celebrating, crying over a moment they hadn't even been part of. And yet, the most important part of the story wasn't going viral. It was staying human. Ozzy never posted about it, never claimed credit, never turned it into a headline. Because the moment wasn't about him. It was about what happens when someone who has already survived everything chooses kindness instead of distance. When a legend doesn't prove his power by taking the spotlight, but by stepping back and letting someone else shine. The kid returned to that same corner later that day, not because he expected Ozzy to come back, not because he expected crowds, but because it was still his place, his starting line. Fame doesn't begin on stages. It begins in the same places where no one was watching. People stopped more often now. Some recognized him. Some didn't. It didn't matter as much as it used to. The song still meant the same thing. The memories still lived inside it. The difference was simple. He believed in himself now, and belief is louder than applause. The internet would argue about what Ozzy should have done next. Should he have signed him? Should he have taken him on tour? Should he have given him more? But that misses the point. Ozzy didn't rescue him. He respected him. And sometimes, respect is the most powerful thing you can give someone who's been invisible. Because it says, I see you as you are, not as a project, not as a charity case, as an equal. That lesson traveled farther than any video ever could. Somewhere, another kid picked up a guitar after watching the clip. Somewhere, someone slowed down on a street they would have walked past before. Somewhere, someone chose to listen instead of scroll. That's how real change works. Not loud, not planned, not branded. Just one person stopping long enough to hear another person's story. The kid still sang, "Mama, I'm coming home." But now, it didn't sound like a question. It sounded like a promise. And the world learned something simple that day. Something easy to forget in all the noisy. You don't have to be famous to matter. You don't have to be loud to be powerful. And you don't have to save someone's life to change it. Sometimes, all you have to do is stop and listen. Would you have stopped to listen, or kept walking?